sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
Okay, so get this. We're going deep on a story that honestly sounds like something straight out of like a movie or something. El Salvador mega prisons. And there's this potential deal with the U.S. that is, it's really got me thinking.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a CBS News article about it, and it covers Secretary of State Marco Rubio's trip down to El Salvador. And let me tell you, things got interesting pretty fast.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Like, this whole thing really kind of flips the script on how we usually think about international agreements, especially for something like prisons.
Right.
Yeah.
So President Nayib Bukele of El Salvador, he's offered to take in deportees from the U.S.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking like the usual cases here.
Right.
We're talking like all nationalities.
Yeah, and it includes people convicted of crimes who are American citizens currently serving time in U.S. prisons.
Whoa, yeah, you heard that right.
Yeah.
It's one thing to say, okay, we'll accept deportees,
Yeah.
but American citizens,
Yeah.
that's something else entirely.
It's definitely unusual.
Have you ever heard of anything like this? Sending U.S. citizens to serve their time in another country's prison?
I mean, it's certainly a curveball, legally speaking. I mean, there are a lot of questions about whether the U.S. can actually outsource its prison system like this, especially when it comes to its own citizens. You know, we'd have to look into any kind of historical precedents and see what kind of legal hurdles something like this would face.
And Bukele is not shying away from the business angle at all either.
Yeah.
He's framing this as like a straight-up deal. Essentially, El Salvador will take on like part of the U.S. prison population for a fee.
Right.
Almost like bidding on a government contract or something.
I know. It makes you think about all the logistics of it, right? I mean, would the U.S. be paying per inmate? Would El Salvador be responsible for these individuals' care, rehabilitation, and eventual release? And then what about the potential for legal disputes or issues arising between the two countries? It's a lot to consider.
It's like opening a massive can of worms, financially and legally. And where would all these people be housed, you might be asking?
Yeah, where would they go?
Well, Bukele has a place in mind, CECOT, a massive brand new prison they're calling the Terrorism Confinement Center.
Yeah, and it's quite a facility. I mean, we're talking 40,000 inmate capacity, high concrete walls, remote jungle location, limited time outside, video link court hearings.
No.
You know, it really kind of paints a stark picture.
Yeah, not exactly Club Med, right?
No.
And here's where things get even more, I think, complicated.
Oh, yeah.
The U.S. State Department has described El Salvador's prison system as harsh and dangerous, with conditions that are already considered, inadequate.
Yeah, and that raises some red flags for sure. I mean, if those are the conditions in their general prison system, what does that mean for American citizens? Potentially convicted of lesser crimes, ending up in a facility specifically designed for terrorists.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're wading into some murky ethical waters here.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
Now, before everyone starts picturing a mass exodus of prisoners down to Central America, a U.S. official has said that there are no current plans to actually deport American citizens.
Yeah. I mean, that's not really surprising to me. Deporting U.S. citizens, I mean, that'd be a legal minefield. It's not just as simple as putting them on a plane and saying, see ya later.
Right. But it makes you wonder why even entertain this offer in the first place. If you look at this through the lens of like the Trump administration's immigration policies, it starts to make a little bit more sense. Rubio has been on this Central America tour, really pushing hard for what are called safe third country agreements.
Yeah, basically the idea is to get other countries to agree to take on the responsibility of processing asylum seekers and housing those who were deported from the U.S. So it kind of shifts the burden,
Right. And to sweeten the deal, the U.S. has been offering some financial incentives like funding deportation flights from Panama.
Right. But of course, these policies are, as you can imagine, incredibly controversial. There are a lot of questions about whether they're actually effective and whether they're ethically sound. I mean, are we really addressing the root causes of the problem, or are we just shifting it around?
Right. It's a big debate for sure. And while we're on the topic of Rubio's trip, let's not forget about this other pressure he was applying. He had some pretty strong words for Panama about China's growing influence at the Panama Canal. Feels like there's more at play here.
Oh, absolutely. This is where we need to kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Rubio's Central America tour isn't just about immigration. It's part of this ongoing chess match between the U.S. and China, this competition for power and influence in Latin America.
So El Salvador and Panama are kind of like pawns in this bigger game.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. And I think understanding the historical context here is really crucial. The U.S. has a long and complicated history of involvement in Latin America, often characterized by interventions and, attempts to control the region.
Speaking of control, things aren't exactly calm back home in Washington either. The U.S. Agency for International Development, USA, is in a bit of turmoil right now. Rubio's taken on the role of acting administrator, but he seems to be delegating most of the day-to-day operations.
Yeah, and this just adds another layer of complexity to the situation. USA plays a big role in U.S. foreign policy, especially in Central America. So its current state of flux raises questions about the U.S.'s diplomatic efforts in the region, Are they going to be consistent, effective? It's tough to say.
Okay, so we've got this controversial mega prison, this unprecedented offer from El Salvador, and this geopolitical power struggle going on in the background. It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here.
And we haven't even touched on the reactions to this potential deal yet. For example, there's Manuel Flores. He's a prominent opposition leader in El Salvador, and he's been super critical of this whole plan. He's calling it a way for the U.S. to just dump garbage in the region.
Yeah, and there are a lot of human rights activists who are raising concerns about El Salvador's track record when it comes to, treating asylum seekers and refugees fairly.
Right. And if you connect that back to the idea of actually housing American citizens in El Salvadorian prisons, it really makes you wonder what could happen to more vulnerable populations like those asylum seekers and refugees who might get caught in the crossfire.
For sure.
So what does all this add up to? We've got a controversial mega prison, an unprecedented offer, this web of political motivations, and a ton of ethical questions swirling around. It's a lot to think about. And honestly, we're just getting started.
Yeah, we're just scratching the surface. Yeah, it really does make you think about it, This whole situation, it really kind of shines a light on the state of U.S. immigration policy and, the U.S.'s relationship with El Salvador. It seems like the Trump administration is willing to consider just about anything to try to curb immigration, even if it means going down some pretty unconventional and controversial roads.
Right. It almost feels like they're just trying to outsource a problem they just don't want to deal with.
Right.
What about El Salvador's perspective in all of this? I mean, they're obviously facing their own challenges. What's their motivation?
Well, you can't ignore the economics of it, El Salvador is a country that relies pretty heavily on U.S. aid. And this deal, it could be a way for them to get some much-needed funding, strengthen their ties with the U.S.
Right. So on the surface, it seems like both countries are getting something out of this.
Yeah.
But is it really that simple?
That's the million-dollar question. Is this a win-win for both sides, Or is it an agreement that's, fundamentally imbalanced? It raises some tough questions about the ethics of it all. Is it really right for the U.S. to essentially export its responsibility for its own citizens?
Yeah.
And what about the people seeking asylum? Are we just, passing the buck?
Right. And what about the human cost of all of this? We're talking about real people, individuals who would be incarcerated in a foreign country, in a prison system that, doesn't exactly have the best reputation.
Yeah.
What would that experience even be like?
Yeah.
Especially for American citizens.
It's hard to imagine. And that's why we need to be having these conversations, making sure that we're considering, all the different angles, all the potential consequences of this deal. It's easy to get caught up in the political stuff and the big picture stuff, but you can't lose sight of the individual lives that would be impacted by this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The human element can't be ignored. This whole thing almost feels like a microcosm of the larger trends we're seeing in the world today.
Yeah.
You've got this rising power, China kind of shaking things up, challenging the old guard. The U.S. is trying to hold on to its influence. And smaller countries like El Salvador and Panama are caught in the middle, trying to figure out how to navigate this new world.
It's definitely a complicated world out there, and there are no easy answers. Foreign policy is this delicate balancing act, right? You're trying to juggle competing interests, you're navigating these ethical dilemmas, and you're trying to anticipate the ripple effects of your actions.
All right, so let's take a step back here and try to kind of synthesize what we've learned so far. We've got this extraordinary offer on the table from El Salvador to take in U.S. deportees, including American citizens.
Right.
And they would be housed in their newly built mega prison, CECOT.
Correct.
We talked about some of the potential motivations driving this. On the U.S. side, it seems to align with the Trump administration's hardline stance on immigration. For El Salvador, there's a clear economic incentive and a desire to strengthen their relationship with the U.S. But we've also talked about some major concerns surrounding this whole deal. the legal complexities of deporting U.S. citizens, the ethical considerations of sending people to a prison system with, let's just say a less than stellar reputation, and the potential impact on vulnerable populations like asylum seekers and refugees. It's a lot.
It really is. And then there's that whole geopolitical context. We're seeing the U.S. and China vying for influence in Latin America, and this deal seems to be playing out against that backdrop. And we can't forget about the internal turmoil within the U.S. government itself, with U.S. aid in such a state of flux.
Yeah. For me, what's so striking is just the audacity of this whole thing. It challenges our traditional understanding of national sovereignty, citizenship, and what it means for a nation to be responsible on the global stage. It's like we're rewriting the rules of the game in real time.
Yeah, and what kind of world are we creating in the process? What are the ethical lines we're willing to cross, and what are the long-term repercussions of the choices we're making today?
It's a lot to think about, and we're going to keep diving deeper.
Yeah.
It's a bit much when you really think about it. This one story, it's got so many layers. Immigration, prisons, geopolitics, the whole U.S.-China thing playing out. It's kind of crazy. Where does it all lead?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And this goes beyond just El Salvador, We're seeing this trend of countries kind of rethinking the way they approach these big issues. Migration, criminal justice. What are the ethical boundaries? How far are we willing to go?
Right. And are we even paying attention to the consequences? It feels like we're so focused on just putting out fires in the short term that we don't stop and think about the long term.
Exactly. We need to be having these conversations, weighing the pros and cons,
Yeah.
thinking about, what happens next, what happens after that. Because what might seem like a simple fix today could turn into a whole other mess tomorrow.
So where do we go from here? What should we even be paying attention to as this story, keeps developing? What are some things our listeners should really be thinking about?
Well, I think it's crucial to stay informed and engaged. Don't just take everything you hear at face value. Do your own research. Look at different perspectives. Form your own opinions. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Challenge assumptions. Yours and everyone else's.
I think that's so important. I mean, we're just bombarded with information constantly. But it's more important now than ever to really think critically. Be able to cut through all the noise and figure out what's really going on.
Yeah, and remember, you've got a voice. Talk about this stuff with your friends, your family, your community. Contact your elected officials. Let them know what you think, what you're worried about. These issues affect everyone, so we all have a responsibility to try to make things better.
It's a good reminder that we're not just sitting on the sidelines watching all this happen. We can do something, whether it's staying informed, talking about these issues, or taking action.
Yeah.
Everything we do matters.
Absolutely. Change starts with awareness, and awareness leads to action. So keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a better world.
Well said. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive for today. We covered a lot, from mega prisons in El Salvador to U.S. immigration policy to the whole U.S.-China rivalry. We looked at the motivations, the controversies, and the possible outcomes of this really complex situation.
We also talked about how important it is to think critically, stay engaged, and use your voice to try to make a difference.
We hope this has given you some things to think about and made you want to learn even more. Remember, the world is a complicated place. There are no easy answers. But by having these conversations and challenging ourselves to think critically, we can all work together to build a better future.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I